أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم من همزه ونفخه ونفثه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuh. We're going to go ahead and get started with the questions, with the check-in questions. So how was your week? How are you managing your emotions? What languages do you use? And how does that impact, meaning whatever languages you use, how does that usage impact how you feel, why you feel that way, and so on. So we're continuing on the thought experiment that we had before about communication and languages, and now we're focusing on the commonalities in languages. So we talked about what are languages, we talked about some other things about languages and stuff, right? But what are some commonalities in languages? What are some things that are across the board, essentially, in languages? And how can we control our emotions? How can we control our emotions? I sort of like mentioned a little bit about that concept in the last thing I said with Muhammad's thing, but also how are emotions, mindsets, and languages all interconnected? We looked at a few videos before, a few TED Talks on how this, how the mind works and stuff, and how languages work and how everything sort of interconnects with each other. So I want you to start thinking about it deeper, right? Because if you can understand these things, then you can actually interact with people from multiple cultures without actually having to understand more than just the commonalities in languages, right? So this is a thought experiment. Think about it. We're going to watch some videos, and after that, we're going to come back and reflect on this stuff, inshallah. Okay, so this is just kind of to prime your mind. So you start looking, your brain starts looking for those kinds of things that that are going to be mentioning something related to this. Okay. Okay, so then the next thing is just a review over here. This is the transformation process. We mentioned about the end vision first. We said the step 0 is being realistic. Step 1 is having an end goal. Step 2 is having like an understanding of the current status where you are, and pretty much analyzing whatever it is that you're looking at and stuff, right? And sometimes we said within the goal, within larger like vision or something like that, you might have small small steps like mile markers or checkpoints or something like step 3, wherein you might actually have to go with step 2 first and then step 1, right? But overall, if you're looking at the broader picture and stuff, right, then in that case you're going to follow this strategy more or less, right? Okay, and then actually this is the overall thing. It's just about, sometimes it's about framing. Like you might say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one in control and stuff, right? And so we have to listen to him and stuff, and so like that's like the current status of how things are and stuff and so on. But then you can also frame it by saying, okay, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to go to a certain end, and so we have to live our life according to that. That means that we have to be, as we were mentioning before, we have to be good at certain things. Like you're not just good at praying and fasting and that's it, but you should also be trying to do other things. Like the Prophet ﷺ encouraged us to help other people and so on, right? So being creative about that. In today's society, helping other people comes with more than just like being there physically. It could be, for example, starting an initiative or a project, or doing some activism or whatever, because that can help people in general. And it's not necessarily like one person is like not enough or whatever. One person is definitely enough, but like when you start these kinds of things, many people can benefit from these kinds of efforts and so on. So these are the kinds of things that we can talk about if you're talking about the broader vision of Islam, for example. And this is when the short-term goals, the mile markers, the checkpoints, that's what we're focusing on really, and about motivation and things like that, because this is the kind of thing that's going to help you really like kind of break through the hurdle that a lot of people end up being in, and that is that they don't actually start thinking about, okay, I can do this and stuff like that, right? Forget even breaking it down. They cannot move from point 2, like step 2 to step 3. So usually that's one of the things that's an obstacle. So right now we're just kind of going over about how the brain works, how the mind works and stuff, so we can actually start focusing on how to like pretty much like get into We mentioned a little bit about the goals, the short-term goals, and we gave examples of that in previous videos. So today we're just kind of like continuing how the brain works and so on, so we can actually transition into the step 4. So with that in mind, let's just do a quick review here. This is sustainable transformation. It's important for it to be sustainable. The Prophet ﷺ also mentioned that Aisha said that the Prophet ﷺ said that the best of deeds are those that are done consistently, even if they're few. Okay, so even if they're few, that the ones that are the best are the ones that are consistent. So sustainability is very important over here, and sustainable growth and development and transformation is very important over here as well, because if you overdo it or you underdo it, you're gonna stop, and you're gonna if you underdo it, you're gonna get bored, and you're gonna get you're not gonna continue. Or if it doesn't have meaning or purpose attached to it, then you're gonna lose it. Especially if it's not a bigger purpose or right. If it's just sort of like temporary, like you just want money and stuff like that. So that's one thing. But if you are getting money but you're really not enjoying your work, for example, then that's not something that we're talking about here. The bigger purpose is the thing that gets you up in the morning and it gets you going and stuff, right? So it's something where, like, even if you weren't getting as much money, you would still really want to do that thing and stuff, right? So that's that. Okay, and then these are still some case studies that we can look at if you guys want to. In the meantime, let us play a game. So somebody pick one of the two and we'll go watch them then. These are again TED Talks. I kind of gave like a little bit about the videos.
The one on the left I'd like to hear first.
Okay.
My research lab sits about a mile from where several bombs exploded during the Boston Marathon in 2013. The surviving bomber, Zakhar Tsarnaev of Chechnya, was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. Now, when a jury has to make the decision between life in prison and the death penalty, they base their decision largely on whether or not the defendant feels remorseful for his actions. Tsarnaev spoke words of apology, but when jurors looked at his face, all they saw was a stone-faced stare. Now, Tsarnaev is guilty. There's no doubt about that. He murdered and maimed innocent people, and I'm not here to debate that. My heart goes out to all the people who suffered. But as a scientist, I have to tell you that jurors do not and cannot detect remorse or any other emotion in anybody ever. Neither can I, and neither can you. And that's because emotions are not what we think they are. They are not universally expressed and recognized. They are not hardwired brain reactions that are uncontrollable. We have misunderstood the nature of emotion for a very long time, and understanding what emotions really are have important consequences for all of us. I have studied emotions as a scientist for the past 25 years, and in my lab, we have probed human faces by measuring electrical signals that cause your facial muscles to contract to make facial expressions. We have scrutinized the human body in emotion. We have analyzed hundreds of physiology studies involving thousands of test subjects. We've scanned hundreds of brains and examined every brain imaging study on emotion that has been published in the past 20 years. And the results of all of this research is overwhelmingly consistent. It may feel to you like your emotions are hardwired and they just trigger and happen to you, but they don't. You might believe that your brain is pre-wired with emotion circuits, that you're born with emotion circuits, but you're not. In fact, none of us in this room have emotion circuits in our brain. In fact, no brain on this planet contains emotion circuits. So what are emotions really? Well, strap on your seatbelt, because emotions are guesses. They are guesses that your brain constructs in the moment where billions of brain cells are working together. And you have more control over those guesses than you might imagine that you do. Now, if that sounds preposterous to you or kind of crazy, I'm right there with you, because frankly, if I hadn't seen the evidence for myself, decades of evidence for myself, I am fairly sure that I wouldn't believe it either. But the bottom line is that emotions are not built into your brain at birth. They are just built. To see what I mean, have a look at this. Right now, your brain is working like crazy. Your neurons are firing like mad, trying to make meaning out of this so that you see something other than black and white blobs. Your brain is sifting through a lifetime of experience, making thousands of guesses at the same time, weighing the probabilities, trying to answer the question, what is this most like? Not what is it, but what is this most like in my past experience? And this is all happening in the blink of an eye. Now, if your brain is still struggling to find a good match and you still see black and white blobs, then you are in a state called experiential blindness. And I am going to cure you of your blindness. This is my favorite part. Are you ready to be cured? All right, here we go. All right. So now, many of you see a snake. And why is that? Because as your brain is sifting through your past experience, there's new knowledge there, the knowledge that came from the photograph. And what's really cool is that that knowledge, which you just acquired moments ago, is changing how you experience these blobs right now. So your brain is constructing the image of a snake where there is no snake. And this kind of a hallucination is what neuroscientists like me call predictions. Predictions are basically the way your brain works. It's business as usual for your brain. Predictions are the basis of every experience that you have. They are the basis of every action that you take. In fact, predictions are what allow you to understand the words that I'm speaking as they come out of my mouth. Exactly.
Okay, so just a comment over here. Remember we talked about the line of best fit. We talked about, data, the human experiences that people go through, like whatever experience that we have had in our lives. And those things, those data points are put together, and then our brains present a trend line or line of best fit. And that's how we look at the world and stuff, right? So if you lived in a very dark or very bad environment or whatever, then in that case, that's what your brain has as data points. And that's how it's going to come up with a trend line. And now obviously that's going to be a very different trend line than the trend line that I might have or a different person might have from a different experience that we might have gone through, right? So what that means is that our trend lines are different. And so since they're different, there can be obviously some conflicts or whatever, but our brains nonetheless are trying to do, they're trying to predict, right? And that prediction is what we're going on over here right now. So there's some things obviously are going to be right, and you're going to keep doing those things, and then you're going to have a habit that develops, or you're going to feel like, okay, what I did over here worked out with reality, and so it must have been the capital T truth, and so on. So it's kind of start thinking about those kinds of things over here.
Predictions are primal, right? They help us to make sense of the world in a quick and efficient way. So your brain does not react to the world. Using past experience, your brain predicts and constructs your experience of the world. The way that we see emotions in others are deeply rooted in predictions, right? So to us, it feels like we just look at someone's face and we just read the emotion that's there in their facial expressions the way that we would read words on a page. But actually, under the hood, your brain is predicting. It's using past experience based on similar situations to try to make meaning. This time, you're not making meaning of blobs, you're making meaning of facial movements, like the curl of a lip or the raise of an eyebrow. And that stone-faced stare? Well, that might be someone who is a remorseless killer. But a stone-faced stare might also mean that someone is stoically accepting defeat, which is in fact what Chechen culture prescribes for someone in Zakir Sarnaev's situation. So the lesson here is that emotions that you seem to detect in other people actually come in part from what's inside your own head. And this is true in the courtroom, but it's also true in the classroom, in the bedroom, and in the boardroom.
Okay, let me play.
And so here's my concern. Tech companies, which shall remain nameless, well, maybe not, Google, Facebook, they come in part from what's inside your own head. And this is true in the courtroom, but it's also true in the classroom, in the bedroom, and in the boardroom. And so here's my concern. Tech companies, which shall remain nameless, well, maybe not, Google, Facebook, are spending millions of research dollars to build emotion detection systems. And they are fundamentally asking the wrong question because they're trying to detect emotions in the face and the body. But emotions aren't in your face and body. Physical movements have no intrinsic emotional meaning. We have to make them meaningful. A human or something else has to connect them to the context, and that makes them meaningful. That's how we know that, a smile might mean sadness, and a cry might mean happiness, and a stoic, still face might mean that you are angrily plotting the demise of your enemy. Now, if I haven't already, gone out on a limb, I'll just edge out on that limb a little further and tell you that the way that you experience your own emotion is exactly the same process. Your brain is basically making predictions, guesses, that it's constructing in the moment with billions of neurons working together. Now, your brain does come pre-wired to make some feelings, right? Simple feelings that come from the physiology of your body. So when you're born, you can make feelings like calmness and agitation, excitement, comfort, discomfort. But these simple feelings are not emotions. They're actually with you every waking moment of your life. They are simple summaries of what's going on inside your body, kind of like a barometer. But they have very little detail, and you need that detail to know what to do next. What do you do about these feelings? And so how does your brain give you that detail? Well, that's what predictions are. Predictions link the sensations in your body that give you these simple feelings with what's going on around you in the world so that you know what to do. And sometimes those constructions are emotions. So for example, if you were to walk into a bakery, your brain might predict that you will encounter the delicious aroma of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. I know my brain would predict the delicious aroma of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies, and our brains might cause our stomachs to churn a little bit to prepare for eating those cookies. And if we are correct, if in fact some cookies have just come out of the oven, then our brains will have constructed hunger, and we are prepared to munch down those cookies and digest them in a very efficient way, meaning that we can eat a lot of them, which would be a really good thing. You guys aren't not laughing enough. I'm totally serious. It's really. But here's the thing, that churning stomach, if it occurs in a different situation, it can have a completely different meaning. So if your brain were to predict a churning stomach in, say, a hospital room while you're waiting for test results, then your brain will be constructing dread or worry or anxiety. And it might cause you to maybe wring your hands or take a deep breath or even cry. Right? Same physical sensation, same churning stomach, different experience. And so the lesson here is that emotions which seem to happen to you are actually made by you. You are not at the mercy of mythical emotion circuits which are buried deep inside some ancient part of your brain. You have more control over your emotions than you think you do. I don't mean that you can just snap your fingers and change how you feel the way that you would change your clothes. But your brain is wired so that if you change the ingredients that your brain uses to make emotion, then you can transform your emotional life. So if you change those ingredients today, you're basically teaching your brain how to predict differently tomorrow. And this is what I call being the architect of your experience. So here's an example. All of us have had a nervous feeling before a test, right? But some people experience crippling anxiety before a test. They have test anxiety. Based on past experiences of taking tests, their brains predict a hammering heartbeat, sweaty hands, so much so that they are unable to actually take the test. They don't perform well, and sometimes they not only fail courses, but they actually might fail college. But here's the thing. A hammering heartbeat is not necessarily anxiety. It could be that your body is preparing to do battle and ace that test. Or, give a talk in front of hundreds of people on a stage where you're being filmed. I'm serious. And research shows that when students learn to make determination, right, this kind of energized determination instead of anxiety, they perform better on tests. And that determination seeds their brain to predict differently in the future, so that they can get their butterflies flying in formation. And if they do that often enough, they not only can pass a test, but it'll be easier for them to pass their courses, and they might even finish college, which has a huge impact on their future earning potential. So I call this emotional intelligence in action. Now you can cultivate this emotional intelligence yourself and use it in your everyday life. So just, Imagine waking up in the morning. I'm sure you've had this experience. I know I have. You know, you wake up in the morning, and as you're emerging into consciousness, you feel this horrible dread, you know, this like real wretchedness. And immediately your mind starts to race, right? You start to think about all the crap that you have to do at work, and that mountain of email, which you will never dig yourself out of, ever, right? And the phone calls you have to return, and that important meeting that you have across town, and you're going to have to fight traffic to get there, which means you're going to be late picking your kids up, and your dog is sick, and what are you going to make for dinner? And oh my God, right? What is wrong with your life? What's wrong with my life? That mind racing is prediction. Your brain is searching to find an explanation for those sensations in your body that you experience as as wretchedness, just like you did with the blobby image. So your brain is trying to explain what caused those sensations so that you know what to do about them. But those sensations might not be an indication that anything is wrong with your life. They might have a purely physical cause. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you didn't sleep enough. Maybe you're hungry. Maybe you're dehydrated. The next time that you feel intense distress, ask yourself, could this have a purely physical cause? Is it possible that you can transform emotional suffering into just mere physical discomfort? Now, I am not suggesting to you that you can just perform a couple of Jedi mind tricks and then talk yourself out of being depressed or anxious or any kind of serious condition. But I am telling you that you have more control over your emotions than you might imagine, and that you have the capacity to turn down the dial on emotional suffering and its consequences for your life by learning how to construct your experiences differently. And all of us can do this. And with a little practice, we can get really good at it. Like driving. At first, it takes a lot of effort, but eventually it becomes pretty automatic. Now, I don't know about you, but I find this to be a really empowering and inspiring message. And the fact that it's backed up by decades of research makes me also happy as a scientist. But I have to also warn you that it does come with some fine print, because more control also means more responsibility. If you are not at the mercy of mythical emotion circuits, which are buried deep inside your brain somewhere and which trigger automatically, then who's responsible? Who's responsible when you behave badly?
And that is the most important question over here. If we can't outsource the cause or the source of these problems and stuff, and we have to then accept responsibility for our own actions, and that sounds something overwhelming for a lot of people. So you can see why it's a lot easier for us to sort of outsource and say, no, somebody else is responsible for what I did or whatever is happening to me. Somebody else is responsible for the emotional thunderstorm that I'm going through. But in reality, what if we end up having to accept that, wait, no, it's actually from my side, and that means I have to be accountable and responsible. So you can see that could be really scary. And so think about that.
You are. Not because you're culpable for your emotions, but because the actions and the experiences that you make today become your brain's predictions for tomorrow. Sometimes we are responsible for something not because we're to blame, but because we're the only ones who can change it. Now, responsibility is a big...
Notice how she reframed it. So she presented something that might otherwise be seen as something to run away from, the overwhelming responsibility and so on, to saying, wait, but how about we change that responsibility into power or control? Same thing, but just framing it differently.
Big word. It's so big, in fact, that sometimes people feel the need to resist the scientific evidence that emotions are built and not built in. The idea that we are responsible for our own emotions seems, very hard to swallow. But what I'm suggesting to you is you don't have to choke on that idea. You just take a deep breath, maybe get yourself a glass of water if you need to, and embrace it. Embrace that responsibility, because it is the path to a healthier body, a more just and informed legal system, and a more flexible and potent emotional life. Thank you.
Okay. Any comments on this one? Any comments? Any thoughts? Any reflections? Anything?
When she mentioned the thing about test anxiety, like I relate to that a lot. but it's, I don't know. I feel like when I was in school and I was trying to like change myself in a way where like I didn't feel anything during an exam. Like I tried everything and it still didn't work. And it's not just like my heart starts pounding, it's more like my mind goes blank.
Yeah. What were you worried about?
You see, I did this trick. Yeah, so I'm worried that I'll get a bad grade. And then if you like trace it back and say, well, okay, if you get one bad grade, are you gonna fail the class? No. And even if you fail the class, like, are you gonna, fail college? And if you fail college, are you gonna become homeless? And I read online about that where you try to rationalize your situation, but it felt like nothing worked.
Okay. So there was something resisting going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what are some other people's thoughts on what he said? Okay, well, I guess we'll come back to that later, inshallah. We'll go ahead and watch this one then.
Language is endlessly variable. Each of us can come up with an infinite number of sentences in our native language, and we're able to do so from an early age, almost as soon as we start to communicate in sentences. How is this possible? In the early 1950s, Noam Chomsky proposed a theory based on the observation that the key to this versatility seems to be grammar. The familiar grammatical structure of an unfamiliar sentence points us toward its meaning. He suggested that there are grammatical rules that apply to all languages, and that the rules are innate. The human brain is hardwired to process language according to these rules. He labeled this faculty universal grammar, and it launched lines of inquiry that shaped both the field of linguistics and the emerging field of cognitive science for decades to come. Chomsky and other researchers set out to investigate the two main components of universal grammar. First, whether there are, in fact, grammar rules that are universal to all languages. And second, whether these rules are hardwired in the brain. In attempts to establish the universal rules of grammar, Chomsky developed an analytical tool known as generative syntax, which represents the order of words in a sentence in hierarchical syntax trees that show what structures are possible. Based on this tree, we could suggest a grammar rule that adverbs must occur in verb phrases. But with more data, it quickly becomes clear that adverbs can appear outside of verb phrases. This simplified example illustrates a major problem. It takes a lot of data from each individual language to establish the rules for that language before we can even begin to determine which rules all languages might have in common. When Chomsky proposed universal grammar, many languages lacked the volume of recorded samples necessary to analyze them using generative syntax. Even with lots of data, mapping the structure of a language is incredibly complex. After 50 years of analysis, we still haven't completely figured out English. As more linguist data was gathered and analyzed, it became clear that languages around the world differ widely, challenging the theory that there were universal grammar rules. In the 1980s, Chomsky revised his theory in an attempt to accommodate this variation. According to his new hypothesis of principles and parameters, all languages shared certain grammatical principles, but could vary in their parameters or the application of these principles. For example, a principle is every sentence must have a subject, but the parameter of whether the subject must be explicitly stated could vary between languages. The hypothesis of principles and parameters still didn't answer the question of which grammatical principles are universal. In the early 2000s, Chomsky suggested that there is just one shared principle called recursion, which means structures can be nested inside each other. Take this sentence, which embeds a sentence within a sentence within a sentence, or this sentence, which embeds a noun phrase in a noun phrase in a noun phrase. Recursion was a good candidate for a universal grammar rule because it can take many forms. However, in 2005, linguists published findings on an Amazonian language called Piraha, which doesn't appear to have any recursive structures. So what about the other part of Chomsky's theory, that our language faculty is innate? When he first proposed universal grammar, the idea that there was a genetically determined aspect of language acquisition had a profound revolutionary impact. It challenged the dominant paradigm called behaviorism. Behaviorists argued that all animal and human behaviors, including language, were acquired from the outside by the mind, which starts out as a blank slate. Today, scientists agree that behaviorism was wrong, and there is underlying genetically encoded biological machinery for language learning. Many think the same biology responsible for language is also responsible for other aspects of cognition. So, they disagree with Chomsky's idea that there is a specific, isolated, unique language faculty in the brain. The theory of universal grammar prompted the documentation and study of many languages that hadn't been studied before. It also caused an old idea to be reevaluated and eventually overthrown to make room for our growing understanding of the human brain. In order to work together.
All right. So what are your thoughts on this so far? By the way, I don't know how this came to be like this. Okay, I don't know. I guess we'll just, oh, there you go. Here, go ahead. So thoughts on this, on these two? Thoughts, reflections, comments. And let's go back to this as well so you guys can have this right.
Going back to the first video, I thought it was interesting how she said that you're responsible for your emotions. It would have been nice to have maybe had a follow-up video on tools to take control of your emotions. I know that's something that a lot of people struggle with.
Yeah.
But I think what she said was, you know, the concept of the brain filling in when the brain filling in, like the picture of the snake, where our brains are working, trying to make sense of the black and the white. And I think that yes, that does happen a lot. I think that's why when you have like 5 or 6 people in one room and they all are hearing and seeing the same thing, that you can have 5 or 6 different opinions about what just occurred. You know, if there was some sort of conflict or something that just happened, is that we all have our reference points that we fill in those blanks, and sometimes we put our ideas of what somebody's intent was. It's also why text message is a very tricky way to communicate. It can be tricky.
Yeah, and it can be, that when you said it can be, I think that makes sense because of the fact that we read a lot of books, for example, and those books are books that people read and they get really fascinated by, and they really enjoy them, and they some of them become really, you know, strong fans of, or really like, you know, they go really deep into like this fandom of like just trying to even enact scenes from that stuff or whatever. So that all happened actually just through words. And so we discussed a little bit about the descriptions and so on. Now, obviously in text messages, you're probably not going to write an entire book. But nonetheless, if you know how to communicate with a particular person and you communicate like that, then text messages are, you know, they can become easier to work with. However, if you don't do that, or if you're generic and you don't use certain strategies to help, you know, accommodate the general tone when addressing multiple different types of people, for example, then that can obviously lead to some difficult situations. Yeah.
Right. And I do believe that also when people read books, they get different different feelings out of it. So I've known cases where, you know, I've read the same book as somebody else, but yet we come up with different opinions of characters and their, you know, what their intentions are. And yeah, so I think that anytime you're using like just one language type, that there is room for interpretation. Like, I think it's a lot, I guess anytime you use language, there's room for interpretation, but it seems to be more prevalent when you're just relying on one thing. You can't see somebody's face as they're saying certain words, or if it's a text message, then there's more likely to be an error, a typo, versus writing a book. It goes through a lot of editing and proofreading, and so those things are addressed more often. But yeah, definitely having multiple inputs helps to get somebody's, like, the correct meaning across when somebody's speaking.
Yeah, I think the idea of intentions is one of those tricky things and stuff, because you know, like the video that she showed, in the video she showed the picture of the person who did that crime, and when she was showing it, she mentioned how the jury pretty much might have reacted and thought, well, this person is not remorseful and so on, and that's it. So in this context, even if we saw him and they actually did see him, they felt like, you know, maybe this is not a remorseful person. So in this case, you know, just understanding, like, it really helps to have multiple dimensions that we can look at. But then at the same time, there are certain things that are I guess, are not going to be 100% guaranteed. So in those cases, we just accept that there is we make an assumption, and we understand that our assumption may be incorrect, but it's something that can help us functioning, you know, as we go forward. Okay, so I see in the chat that it was a little bit difficult to hear the last video. Um, if you want, you can type in what do all languages have common and TED Talk. So it should show up. It was a 5-minute video. So let's see if you can get that. Now, I don't know if you couldn't hear me because my volume was low, or you couldn't hear me because the video was somehow not, or maybe the internet wasn't working well. Was it choppy or was it not? Like, was it just low volume? Okay, what was the sound? Okay, okay, noted. So I'll keep that in mind, inshallah, and then next time I'll try to make sure that that sound isn't there. I'll go and like, I'll try to see if I can locate or be in a room or in a place where there would be, like, you know, absolutely no background noise or something like that. So let me try that next time, inshallah. So in the meantime, I think we can figure out at least some of this. I think if you were able to read the, I don't remember if they had the captions, but if you were able to read the captions, then that would be good. But they were just talking about some of the things that Noam Chomsky he had proposed, and he was talking about universal language, you know, the universal grammar, for example, and so on, some commonalities in that. Yeah. So the questions that I had asked earlier were related to language, specifically how you can, what are languages, and notice our definition of language is a little bit different, but ultimately it's all about communication. So what are some communication strategies or tools, or, you know, modes of communication that we use? Among them are, you know, gestures, hand movements. We have emotional language. You might hug somebody, you might have some, you know, expressions of emotions, for example, where you're crying or you're smiling and so on. So what are all those things? What do they all have in common? That's the question over here. And understanding that, and understanding how our brain works, how do we control our emotions? Think about these questions. And we did answer this before, actually, when one of you was mentioning something um, about their experience, you know, in a test or whatever. So we discussed like, what is something that you can do, and where do emotions actually come from? And we discussed a little bit about the root of the matter, and then how to how your emotions therefore are connected to that. So how you can go back and change that root, change that rubric, as I was saying, and you'll be able to manage your emotions a little bit better. Maybe there's an assumption in the emotions, or sorry, in the rubric that you are not finding happening in real life, and so then it causes this issue right here where it seems to be a conflict, and then you get then the negative emotional consequence, or the negative emotion comes in. So any thoughts on this? Or would you like more time to think about it?
I would say the commonalities for the languages is they all have their, like, they can each have the same objective.
Okay, so the objective is important over here. Two people might be speaking the same words, same language, same everything, but their objective might be slightly, their objective is the same in terms of communication, but their mode, like their way of using that language, for example, may have different meaning and stuff. So even though there are some differences like that, ultimately the objective is, for example, to communicate. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like, yeah, you, like, someone could use it to inform someone, or they can use it to, like, tell them how they feel, or yeah.
Okay, so there's some information, some piece of information that you have acquired, whether it's about you, about yourself, right? About your experiences, or about other things that you've come to know about. That information you're trying to communicate with somebody else, right? And that can be communicated through, like, the games like Pictionary, for example. It could be done through, like, Hangman, for example, where that you do guessing. It could be done through, for example, actually doing quizzes or tests or whatever, or, like, giving lectures or seminars or whatever it might be, or it might be giving, like, hand gestures, or things like that. So ultimately the idea is to try to communicate, and ultimately also people are trying to connect with, like, how they think, how they what experiences that they have, so they're just pulling from there and they're trying to communicate. So if you just understand where they're coming from, then you'll be able to calibrate your system and then understand what they're trying to say, and actually communicate with them as well, because you understand like where they're coming from, pretty much. And I saw in the chat that you guys would like, or at least one of you would like to have some more time to think about it. So that's fine. Take your time. These are some important questions to consider. This is how we interact with each other. This is how this is where relationships can get better, or they can get worse. So they can get better, or they can get worse. So this is very important. And when it comes to manners, when it comes to etiquette, when it comes to all of that is just simply portraying something. So if you want to respect somebody in a particular culture, you do certain things a certain way, and that communicates with them, that informs the other person that this is how you're treating them, you're respecting them, or whatever, right? In a different culture, you might do it slightly different. In Islam, there are certain things that are universal, like mercy and kindness and stuff is universal. Now the boundaries that are associated with it may be misunderstood. For example, somebody might ask the question, how can a loving God have like allow like bad things to happen in the world, like hunger, starvation, and war and things like that? So the answer is, oh, actually, I'm not going to give you the answer. I want you to think about it. So think about it. Think about what the person is like, what people are doing when they're asking this question. What are some assumptions that people are making, the questioner is making, when they're asking the question? And how do you address those assumptions before you even answer the question? Think about it like that, right? Are all the assumptions the person making valid, or are the assumptions not valid? Because if the assumptions are not valid, therefore the question that is built upon these assumptions is not valid, and so therefore it doesn't need an answer necessarily. So this is where you would go back and figure that out. But again, that also connects to the idea of having a rubric, and that's related to your emotions, and that relates to also your mindset, and that also relates to how languages are also interconnected with emotions and mindset. So, but in the meantime, go ahead and take your time, find think about it more, see if you can find any research, see if you can find any meta studies done on this stuff, and see if we can, or if even if you can bring something from the Deen, then let's do that. And next time, maybe you guys can start sharing some of those things that you've come up with. But ultimately, the idea is just to use this in your context and apply this in your life as much as possible, so you can actually reframe your life, so that you can actually start becoming extremely productive and successful and happy and content and like not frustrated ever, not overwhelmed, not worried, not grieving, not depressed. All those things. You're feeling good. You're not feeling upset or negative. So, and everything in your life is working out perfectly. So, how can this help in that regard? Think about all these things, inshallah. So if there isn't anything else, we'll go ahead and close, inshallah. And I will go ahead and stop the recording. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.